Hi, my name is Vikki Hill. I'm the Project Associate for Changing Mindsets at University of the Arts London, and I'm delighted to welcome Dr Gurnam Singh, who's Principal Lecturer in Social Work at Coventry University. And he's also Visiting Fellow in Race and Education here at University of the Arts. He's here today to talk to us about the attainment gap and some of the terminology that we're using around it. So, hi, welcome.
Hi Vicky, thanks for having me.
Okay, just to fire off straight away, Gurnam, there's lots of terminology that we hear: attainment gap, attainment differentials, attainment challenge. Can you just explain to us what do all these terms mean?
Of course, any word has no meaning without a context, and meanings are always contingent in time and space. So really, within the context of higher education, these concepts are linked to statistics that have consistently that have come out from HEF, the Higher Education Funding Council, and the Equality Challenge Unit, revealing correlations between ethnicity, gender, and social class and degree classification. And we know that in the UK, we classify degrees by a first class, upper second, second class, and then a third, and then an ordinary degree. So we do find some disparities along those social divisions, really. So that's what we mean by attainment gaps or degree attainment differentials. Of course, it raises another question as to why are those there, and we can explore that in terms of much of the kind of policy framework that's been looking at that. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thank you. And you've been using the term awarding gap. How did this come about?
Okay, well, if I can make the bridge with attainment gaps. So the attainment gap and it's called the attainment challenges, where consistently black and minority ethnic students, there are variations amongst ethnic groups, but broadly speaking, and interestingly, white working class students perform much worse than white students if you control for everything else. And so the problem with the degree attainment gap or degree attainment is that the focus implies that it's the student that's failing in some way, or that there's a deficit.
Yeah.
So one of the kind of critiques of the attainment gap model is that we really need to focus more on the institutions. And again, it's important to understand the context. This whole debate around student attainment really kind of comes off the back of the widening participation agenda in the 1990s, where we got massive expansion of higher education. But also really important was the Race Relations Amendment Act in 2000, which came out as a consequence of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, which was all about institutional racism. So I guess the reason for going for more focusing on degree awarding, for example, this is the other concept that I've been trying to talk about, is that we take the attention towards institutions and the processes of exclusion, if you like, and the responsibility also gets taken back to the institution as opposed to the responsibility with being with the student. Of course, in the learning process, it's always a shared responsibility, but I think that if students are paying £9,000 a year fees, and the universities are prepared to take their money, then they also have responsibility for value for money.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And so what does this mean in sort of practical terms to be considering the awarding gap rather than the attainment gap?
Well, of course, I think just like attainment gap doesn't necessarily only focus on the individual, it largely focused on, that was the result in practical terms, it was largely about correcting students or teaching students how to write or how to behave, or the degree awarding gap shifts most of the emphasis on institution processes. But as I say, it's still, the student still has a responsibility. And I think much of the work that I've done really, if we look at what might be the reason for these gaps in awarding or attainment, if you like, are a kind of complex kind of interplay between institutional processes, but also what you might call the kind of psychosocial domain of the student, how the student themselves sees themselves within the institution. Mm-hmm. So, working at all those levels is critical to understanding both why these gaps take place, but also how we can actually undo them.
Yeah, absolutely. So what might be problematic for the universities and institutions about using the term awarding gap? And do you have any thoughts on how we might address this?
Well, I think I think there is a kind of arrogance amongst universities, which is, we are kind of finishing schools. Students have been given the building blocks in primary education and secondary education, and now then higher education. And the whole idea of the independent learner, the self-directed learner. Whilst those things are true, and we shouldn't lose that wonderful kind of opportunity for students to explore, if you like. I think the complexity of assessment. I think the demands on students, the demands for teaching a whole set of new skills, maybe new knowledge. I think that we can't just let the students, as it were, fend for themselves. And I guess, therefore, the implications for focusing on this work are particularly about pedagogy, about how we can develop pedagogies that, what I say is that don't cause more damage than already been caused. And historically, I think higher education has been into the pedagogy, has been very didactic. It's been, and I think maybe the University of Arts is an exception because you are a creative university, and therefore many of your assessment methods are quite creative. But we do find that my work as well, that the more you vary the assessment method, the more you vary the teaching method, the more opportunities that all students have to capitalize on their own natural talents, if you like.
Yeah.
And so it's a kind of mixture of, the relationships is a really important thing. The students' relationships with each other are important, but also with staff and with the institution. And one of the key issues that came up in my research was that, really creative, committed academic staff can make a difference because they can inspire students and they can help students to navigate the kind of complexities of higher education. And we talked about this term that they can become interlocutors. An interlocutor is a very interesting Latin term that means in between, and locu is to speak. So they're in a sense speaking between the student and the institution, if you like. So they become a really crucial element. And I think to understand that role is really critical, the role of the interlocutor.
Yeah.
I often pose a question. We can't remember every teacher from school, but we can remember those teachers that just helped us to see beyond ourselves. And I think the other interesting thing about this locutor is this almost play on locks that they can also unlock. Yeah, so they can act as kind of keys, I think, to unlock potential.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point that I think I've read as well, that you've been writing some personal experiences about your own education. Did you have an experience with an interlocutor that you would want to share?
Well, I think that's a really important thing that again, all of us, even if we've come from, say, disadvantaged backgrounds, if we come from experience of discrimination, we're not empty vessels. And I think that's really important, not to see anybody as a victim. So I try not to see myself as a victim, but I can reflect with certain individuals that I think the key thing was that they both validated, they give you a sense of validation as a human being. I think that's really important, especially when you're younger, because you do need validation from adults. But I think the really crucial thing was that they almost release. They give you this sense of release. So that's what I was thinking about. That they open up the door, and they can do that in very symbolic ways. I can remember, for example, the sociology teacher that when we were, I think it was in the fifth form, said, use my first name. And this was a school where it's very formal. And all of a sudden, those barriers were broken down. And that he was encouraging us to talk about our own life stories. Again, that was something that wasn't really encouraged much. So I think that these people can help you to, see aspects of your own life or situate your own life within the learning experience. I think that's really important, and takes quite a lot of skill as well and courage to do.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. Okay. And finally, what else has your research uncovered about how to close this
gap?
Yeah.
Well, I think you can summarize it in terms of 4 domains. The first one, which I've already been talking about, is the whole thing about learning relationships. There are many relationships in universities. There are relationships between students. And so, for example, if you look at the attainment of Southeast Asian students in the United States, in US universities, they're the highest attainers. And I think they found that one of the reasons why is that they form these study groups, these kind of student mutually supportive study groups. It's almost part of their being, yeah. So if a student gets isolated, if they're not really engaging, then that immediately is a cause for concern. So I think we need to work very hard, particularly at the beginning, to enable students to build those learning relationships, and those could be both with students and with students and staff. Then the second one is, and this is the one that sociologists have kind of done a lot of work on, is social capital. I think the danger with the social or cultural capital model is that you could slip into a deficit there. You could say, well, these people haven't got much. And so I say that they have social capital, but maybe the currency, it's a bit like money. You might have some money, but it might be foreign currency. So our job isn't to deny them the capital that they have, but how can we translate that capital into useful capital? Yeah. And I think that so it's not filling them with social capital, but trying to transform their social capital in ways that we see kind of benefits their learning. But certainly, having information, having contacts, having networks, is important. The third one, I think, is the whole psychosocial domain, which is, and I've done a bit of work on this, about this process of othering. I think certainly if you come from a professional middle-class white background, then entering university isn't an other space. It's home from home. It's a space which you are naturally expected to occupy. But if you come from a non-traditional background, then you become othered in quite extreme ways when you go to university. I still feel like I'm the other, although I've spent the last 20 odd years in universities. I still kind of feel I don't belong here. So if I can feel that, how do those students who have come into university for the first time feel? So I think we need to try to disrupt othering and everything that is associated with the process of othering. Some of it might be quite harmless, but other forms of othering can be the very essence of racism, of discrimination, particularly where the other is seen to be an inferior other. And then students will internalize that. And the fourth one, I think, is the whole domain of pedagogy. I think that there's a lot of work that we can do in terms of critical pedagogy, for example. I think it's a really important tool, which is really about enabling students to situate themselves in the learning process. I think that can lead to empowerment, but I think critical pedagogy also disrupts hierarchical forms of knowledge and knowing, and so we need to be enabling students, particularly maybe in an arts university where creativity in the student's self expression is really critical. And if we tell the students that they really haven't got much to contribute from themselves and that they have to somehow learn a canon that maybe they see as representing their own oppression, then we need to challenge those ideas of privileging certain forms of knowledge.
Great. Gurnam, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. We're going to wrap it up there.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.